Trea is a PhD student here at the Natural Resources Institute, and we welcome her. Thanks for joining. And is there anything, maybe I'll let you introduce yourself then.
Okay. Hi, thank you for having me present. My name is Trea StormHunter. I'm Anishinaabe and Ukrainian, PhD student at University of Manitoba. Currently in Edmonton. A lot of my research focuses on the abolishment of the Indian Act and the unfair practices of what I call are the big resource mining companies in regards to completing IBAs, which are impact and benefit agreements, and how they disproportionately negatively impact Indigenous communities. In particular, I kind of look through the different relationships that Indigenous people have with the Canadian government and also the British, and how oppressive legislation is preventing, I would say, Indigenous people in effectively engaging in the mainstream economy and supporting their Indigenous economies when we're looking at resource consumption and what's going to be left for future generations. So that's just kind of a little bit of my interest. I'm very interested also in Indigenous philanthropy and moving Indigenous people from a welfare-based economy where their sole reliance is on government funding to self-determination and more sovereignty and nation-to-nation building. So that's a little bit of my passions. So basically, this is part of my thesis that I completed in my Master of Business Administration at Cape Breton University. So I focused on resource extraction and First Nation communities in Canada. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on the Saluit community, which is in northern Quebec. It's considered NUNAVIK, and it's an Inuit community. And I'm going to take us over to the West Coast, and we're going to look at the Osoyoos Indian Band and how different economic prosperity and geographic location can look in regards to negotiating socioeconomic opportunities for communities. So I think some key things, oh, hang on, I have to, there we go. All right, so just some key things. I'm just gonna look at Indigenous culture as a paradigm in sustainability, the context of the research, my methodology, and moving forward from there. So Indigenous culture as a paradigm of sustainability is, I'm gonna move this, there we go. Indigenous culture requires like the same level of awareness as the significance of Western ecological models towards sustainability. So when we look at movements towards sustainable development, it's primarily prompted through an ecological perspective. And we look at addressing valid concerns such as deforestation, extraction of precious resources, and the loss of local and cultural knowledge. Now, research regarding sustainable development has expanded to include the diversity of human cultures. And then when we look at what's the definition of culture, it's a system of shared symbols, behaviors, and beliefs, values, norms, artifacts, and institutions that the members of a society use to cope with their world and with one another. And they're transmitted from generation to generation through learning. And when we look at sustainable development calls for the protection of traditional ecological knowledge. I'll just refer to it as TEK. And it's becoming increasingly significant where adaptation to climate change is going to require local responses. So sustainable development requires the teaching and passing down of TEK from one generation to the next. So I believe that these two things are linked very closely together. And when we look at colonization, or the context of the research, colonization has decimated the self-reliant and socially cohesive Indigenous communities who've suffered significantly since contact. And then this suffering is the direct result of shifting economic forces, encroaching on Indigenous territories along with forced assimilation and acculturation. Now, this history is part of what I call Canada's ugly dark side, and it's usually told through the lens of the colonizers. Just in recent years, we're starting to hear more of the Indigenous voice and kind of the impacts of Canada's dark history. We have like the RCAP, the Royal Commission, we have the Truth and Reconciliation, which is starting to share the stories of the Indigenous peoples and what our grandparents and great-grandparents and so on went through. But what receives less attention is the degree of community cohesion that remains the desire among Indigenous people to rebuild their communities on traditional and culturally grounded foundation. So I examined 3 case studies of Indigenous communities, and they're under 3 different negotiated treaty territories living on or near sought after natural resources. I explore how and if the role of TEK is an essential element in the negotiation process to improve Indigenous communities' conditions based on their natural resources. And I look at answering the following questions. So, are natural resources a blessing or a curse for Indigenous people towards their goal of self-determination and improving their overall socioeconomic status? Can Indigenous people in Canada compete on their terms? So using local TEK land management and sustainability and mainstream economy and achieve self-determination. Now, what kinds of actions do Indigenous communities need to undertake to encourage economic growth? And then why are only some communities able to prosper while many continue to live below the poverty line? So those are my questions. So I think one of the important things is when we look at treaties and land claims agreements, since European contact, there's 3 distinct negotiated agreements related to First Nations people. And it's really important to distinguish between these signed agreements because it directly impacts the community's economic development initiatives on their respective territories. So the very first agreements were those of treaties of peace and friendship. And they were first created with the British. They were signed with the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy First Nations before 1779. And these territories are often referred to as unceded territory. And so the purpose of this treaty was to establish what rights settlers and Aboriginals had to the land. So it was kind of a process of negotiation. The second set of treaties that came in were the numbered treaties, and they were negotiated between 1871 and 1921 with the Canadian government, and they were created specifically for the goal of resource extraction and settler expansion. And currently there is 11 numbered treaties in Canada. And I would say that the purpose of these treaties specifically was to extinguish Aboriginal title to lands, to compensate First Nations for this surrender, and framed within a broader context, I would say, of civilizing Indians. And so there's different views on this, but I mean, this is just a general overview. And then finally, we have modern day land claim agreements, which allows FNs to negotiate at all 3 levels of government. And the primary focus is on Indigenous economic development. So these new agreements, they provide FNs with more negotiating power as their traditional rights to land take precedence. And then since 1975, there's been 26 land claim agreements signed with the Government of Canada. And the purpose for these agreements tend to fall around nation to nation between FNs, federal and provincial, Crown, a territory that enables Indigenous people to rebuild their communities and nations on their terms. So 3 very different agreements with 3 very different purposes that impact both positively and negatively for Indigenous people in Canada. Now, when we look at resource development and Aboriginal culture, one of the key things of my interest is traditional knowledge. And if we look at traditional knowledge, it's a holistic framework and it's passed down through generations. It's connected to our traditional lands. And the integrity of this knowledge depends on maintaining the integrity of the land itself. So, and we'll look at what that looks like a little farther on. Traditional knowledge is linked to Aboriginal treaty rights under Section 35, and it's protected under Section 35 and 52 of the 1982 Constitution Act. The common theme among Indigenous people throughout Canada is that traditional knowledge is about relationships, not resources. And this relationship is rooted in stewardship of the land and reciprocity. So it doesn't matter what tribe you talk to, TEK, this is like a common theme. So this is just what Section 35 of the Constitution Act is, and that just states that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. And this came about through numerous Aboriginal groups having court challenges, and then it was intended that Aboriginal rights would be defined further through constitutional amendments, but that never materialized. And so the interpreting Section 35 has fallen to the courts, which you can look right now at the Supreme Court of Canada. There's a number of cases that are before the Supreme Court of Canada, and they've been in there, some for 10, 20 years, just about establishing what our rights are and to the land. So when we look at traditional ecological knowledge, this is just an expansion or an extension of traditional knowledge. And basically, the justice, humans are inferior to and not responsible for nature. Instead, we're interconnected to nature. And its essential aspect is that everything non-human is also dependent on humans. The ecology is shaped by the way humans live and the activities that take place in that environment. And then for TEK to be sustainable, it must be able to be modified in response to the environment. So there's always a constant communication between the natural world and humans must be responsive and in close association with nature to reduce the irreversible and adverse impacts on the environment. So it's really important that how I'm engaging with the world now, that my children and my grandchildren and my great-great-grandchildren have the same opportunities that I have with the resources that are currently available on Mother Earth, I would say. So let me see, where am I here? Oh, hang on, I've got you guys somewhere here. I just got to move you. Okay, so when we look at what are some criticisms of TEK, hang on, I got to move you here. So there's a lot of inconsistent definitions of what TK and TEK is. And TEK is the product of like Western packaging. So traditional knowledge doesn't it does not represent Indigenous knowledge systems in their wholeness. And TEK is conceived as something specific to place, particular people, and is differentiated in both form and content from other types of scientific knowledge. So it can't be, so if we look at studies of TEK, like if we're looking at it from a Western worldview, they say that studies can't be replicated because TEK is different among different localities, like depending on where you are and what tribe you come from. So when we look at sustainable development, First Nations and European settlers have opposing views on what sustainable development is. We look for a land living in harmony with the environment, where European settlers look at how can we conquer this and what can we consume from it? How can we benefit ourselves? And then there was really no definition of what sustainable development looked like. So in 1987, the RAGLAN report, they coined the term sustainable development by the UN World Commission. And they said that sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the RAGLAN report clearly parallels key aspects of what TEK is. Environmental concerns are significant. The environment should be cared for not because of its intrinsic value, but in order to preserve resources for our children. And then finally, An ethical argument is a holistic approach, and that believes that resource extraction companies must have sustainable development built into their business ethics, and it must include, again, all Earth's inhabitants, both human and non-human. An ethical business approach is considered a moral responsibility. And similar to TEK's concept of respectful relationship, we ensure that all activities involving non-humans are economically sustainable, and it requires an obligation for minimal harm and impact to the ecosystem. So therefore, sustainable development, there are, hang on, I'm just gonna move this, requires some significant constraints on agricultural land, physical limits, and biological thresholds. So when we look at what is a constraint, it's usually defined as factors that make it difficult for ecological adaptation. So for example, an agricultural constraint are mass deforestation and increasing land degradation. So we can look the picture there. And then we look at a physical constraint is the ability for humans and natural ecosystems to adapt to climate change. And then we look at a biological constraint, and that includes what is our coping capacity to deal with adaptation. So when we look at sustainable development as an ethical approach to resource extraction, what are some of the key factors? Well, an ethical approach to sustainable development includes two types of capital. We have natural and we have cultural. Natural capital closely monitors the ecological footprint. Science believes the planet is in a deficit of natural capital concerning the growing world population. And natural capital is also linked to Earth's natural resources. So to be morally and ethically responsible, resources need to be preserved, again, for our children and our children's children. And then we look at cultural capital. It's directly related to how natural capital is used. So you can't have one without the other. Cultural capital includes the shared knowledge, beliefs, and values that form the basis of a community, such as TEK. And this basis relates to human interactions with their surrounding environment, and when guided through moral conscience, results in sound ecological behavior. So that brings us to Indigenous economies. So one of the quotes that I like is by Rebecca Adamson, and she says, for Indigenous people, the goal for our land is about protection, but it is also about use. You can't have protection without use. And we see ourselves as so integrated with our territory that our protection is tied to our use, and our use is tied to our protection. So these are totally interrelated and interconnected, and we use the resources on our territory to live. So traditional subsistence economies in Canada have included several economic systems evolving over thousands of years, providing material goods and distinct services in a renewable way. And so we look at the way we hunt, the way we fish, the way we use the animals. We look at, and this is all throughout, like how our food systems are and our hunting grounds, all of that traditional knowledge and subsistence economies was our way of survival, trade, everything. So Indigenous communities now are under high pressure to conform to a capitalist market economy. And communities on or close to an abundance of natural resources are under constant threat and often criticized by mainstream resource mongers for wanting to continue in their traditional way of life. Six Nations member Ron Jamieson, he did an opening address and he was the chair for the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. And he stated that economic development on Aboriginal communities is not a priority, nor is it geared towards self-determination or sustainability. He argued that the Canadian government sets communities up for failure when they first began transferring power over programs for Aboriginal administration. So what does that mean? It means that social programs, social assistance and child welfare were the first to be transferred. So we all know that social welfare programs do not create independence. They reinforce dependency on the same systems that have disrupted Indigenous lifestyle. And so he further hypothesizes that if the Canadian government truly supported self-determination, that they should have begun with the transfer of economic programs. He should have set Indigenous communities up for success, not for creating a welfare-dependent reservations. So many Indigenous communities aren't seen as viable economic entities, and they continue to negotiate under policies that are rooted in assimilation, and therefore economic development in Indigenous communities is pretty much inadequate or non-existent. And then when opportunities are presented, typically large development corporations want to use the land, carry out enormous projects for their economic gain, and provide minimal opportunities for sustainable economic development for Indigenous small businesses. So they bring people from the outside in, despite the fact that they say that they're going to be hiring within. That rarely happens. And then the constant pressure for Indigenous communities to conform to profit-driven development projects such as logging, mining, hydro, oil, and gas continues to peel away thin layers of Indigenous identity rooted in subsistence economic activities. And what this does is it disrupts how TEK is accessed and communicated to the community. And so as a result, Indigenous economies are viewed as not as an obstacle to the commercial economies of natural resources. So what can we do moving forward? So moving forward for successful Indigenous economic development, you have to focus on supporting mixed economies. And then the Canadian government must actively begin implementing the TRC call to action, Action 92. And I've just put that up, which is business and reconciliation. So we call on the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the UNDRIP declaration. And then it's committed to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, maintaining free, prior, and informed consent. Aboriginal people have equitable access to jobs, training, and education. And they provide education for management and staff. Which is a key thing that's not, if you look at a lot of the mining companies in the mining camps, usually the Indigenous people or of that particular area are stuck in low-paying jobs, such as they're the cooks, they're the cleaners, they're the janitors. They're not anything that where their voice can be heard. So, when we look at for actual fruition of the mixed economy, we have to acknowledge that subsistence economies need to form the scouting and exploration component, and it must be considered in all negotiations and agreements. And to increase the socioeconomic conditions for the communities that are impacted. Now, when I looked at a case study, this was in NUNAVIK. This is with the Saluit community, and they're under a modern day land claims agreement. So one of the last agreement that I had presented to you guys. And so basically the Canadian North has an abundance of natural resources, water, forestry, precious metals, and it's a primary focus for a lot of resource extraction corporate giants. And then unfortunately, due to the short-term life of the mines, 5 to 30 years, the Inuit have experienced both positive and negative socioeconomic consequences. Initially, many Inuit would be trained and employed at the mine, and they thought that that had a positive socioeconomic effect for community members, but the downside was their traditional subsistence economies declined, and that led to a negative relationship or a negative effect in their relationship with the land. And there's been a lot of studies that show that when Indigenous people are taken away from that connection to their land, they fill that void with things like drugs and alcohol, unhealthy behaviors. There's a lot of domestic violence. And so there's all these other social impacts that are heightened when you remove their connection with subsistence or economies or a traditional way of life. So the actors involved in the negotiations for the Raglan mine agreement, they had commitments with a specific person. So they wanted to, purpose. So they wanted to improve the socioeconomic conditions of the Saluet community. They wanted to ensure minimal impacts to their subsistence traditional economies. And the Inuit framework tool that I use, the TEK, is rooted on Inuit traditional knowledge. And don't ask me to pronounce the Q word. It's just referred to as the IQ principles. And so these IQ principles were developed in 1999, and they by a Sustainable Development Working Group. And basically, they look at the past, present, and future experience, knowledge, and values of the Inuit, and there's 6 guiding principles. So there's the concept of serving, the concept consensus decision-making, concept of skills and knowledge acquisition, collaborative relationships, working together, environmental stewardship, and being resourceful to solve problems. And so the 3 questions that I was looking at was, have the socioeconomic conditions of the Saluet Inuit community improved since involvement with MAKIVIK and the Raglan mine? Are the signed agreements and commitments between them, are they meeting the IQ principles? And what are the impressions of the Saluet community members towards the MAKIVIK Corporation? And are they feeling that the MAKIVIK Corporation is representing their best interests? So when we looked at the northern economy, the people of the Arctic solely lived off the land. Their relationship with the land was dependent on their survival, and their leader, anybody who was appointed a leader, they were appointed based on their superior survival skills. So if you can imagine living in -72 in the winter and surviving, I think, I know I couldn't do it. And then with colonization, encroachment, and the discovery of vast natural resources, 2 other economies began to emerge in the Arctic. And so we have the informal economy, and then the formal economy, the encroachment came into play, and that consists of resource extraction, large-scale oil and gas, and that directly impacts the informal economy. And then we have the government of colonization, who is the largest segment and employer in the north. So basically, if you don't work for the government, if you live up in the north, or you're not trained and can work in a mining company, you're pretty much on welfare, which I said is that's like a dependent. Yeah, you have no power in my mind. So these 3 economies comprised a unique relationship with one another, and they hold very different values. So the informal economy is rooted in the balance between humans and nature and directly impacts their survival. The formal encroachment economy is based on outsiders coming into their territory, extracting what they want, making their money, and then leaving. And then the government, which relies on both employment and welfare based economy. So according to Stats Canada, social assistance in Nunavik is disproportionately higher than the rest of Quebec. So the balance between the first IQ5 and the other economies should potentially bring the highest socioeconomic benefits for Nunavik Inuit, and this isn't the case. So the MAKIVIK Corporation, it came into play in 1978 to administer funds from the first comprehensive Inuit land claim in Canada. In 2007, the MAKIVIK and the Canadian government created the Nunavik Inuit Lands Claim Agreement after 14 years of negotiation. And then the key theme in the MAKIVIK mandate was community economic development, Inuit job creation, and preserving culture and the natural environment. So those were the key themes that the MAKIVIK mandate is supposed to adhere to. Now, MAKIVIK negotiates all of the impact and benefit agreements with mining companies in that region. So consensus decision making. So we look at the 1995 Raglan Mine Agreement, Then there's the 2008 NUNAVIK nickel mine agreement. And the following objectives are identified in the policy manual: to establish open dialogue, to maximize short and long-term social and economic benefits, and to minimize negative social and environmental impacts. So the first Magnum or RAGLAN mine agreement addresses matters related to conflict resolution, training and employment, and the protection of the environment. And so this is what my research focused on: is, are they addressing those matters in a way that benefits all parties involved? The RAGLAN mine agreement is seen as like one of the key, it's often used as a key reference point for other Aboriginal agreements in mining, and it's viewed as a hugely successful agreement in which all parties' needs were included. However, the current RAGLAN agreement commitments must be carefully scrutinized for potential socioeconomic gaps using the sustainable development of the 3 IQ principles listed above. So basically, this was the outcome of it. So when I looked at consensus and decision making, each group in here felt that their needs were heard, or their voice was heard. And even independent case studies on reports supported that. When we looked at the skills and knowledge acquisition, MAKIVIK and Glencore said, yeah, we're totally doing it. The Saluet community said it's only happening for some people, but not all. And independent case study reports support that view as well. And then when we look at environmental stewardship, MAKIVIK and the RAGLAN mine are like, yeah, we are, and we're preserving the land. But when you talk to the Saluet community members and you look at independent cases, both of them say that this is not happening, and their traditional subsistence economies and their ways of life are being decimated up there. And what they could do before in their hunting with the caribou, and that is non-existent, pretty much non-existent. So what was the outcome? The benefits of past mines mostly do not persist after the mine's closure, leaving communities having to adapt to loss of employment, dealing with environmental mess, toxic legacies, impacts to and other impacts to wildlife. Mainstream literature fails to address many of the areas of concern identified by the Inuit on their subsistence traditional activities. It's not working to benefit the Inuit people in this situation, in particular IQ5's concept of land stewardship. And daily life struggles and wage economy are very different from day-to-day problems faced by Inuit in a traditional society. So these differences, without the proper tools in transition, I think is going to leave a lot of Indigenous people, in particular from the North, lost between two worlds. And again, lacking the necessary tools to cope with either one, which again, for me is takes me back to residential school, where Indigenous people were stuck between two worlds. They couldn't go back to their reserve. They had their loss of language, their loss of land knowledge, but yet they weren't educated enough or trained well enough to be successful in the non-Indigenous world, in the Western ways or the European settler way. So there's been like no improvements there. So now we're going to look at Indigenous sovereignty with the Osoyoos Indian Band. And so basically it's one of 8 Okanagan nation alliances, which was originally, sorry, my mouth is dry, formed in 1877. And these First Nation communities negotiate outside of BC treaty process. They build relationships and address concerns only associated with land and resource use used on asserted traditional territories. And the Okanagan Nation Declaration is, we are the unconquered Aboriginal people of this land. The Creator it was given to us, our mother, to enjoy, to manage, and to protect. We, the first inhabitants, have lived with this mother from time immemorial. Our Okanagan governments have allowed us to share equally in the resources of our mother. We have never given up our rights, our mother's our mother's resources, our governments, and our religion. We will survive and continue to govern our mother and her resources for the good of all for all time. So Chief Clarence Louis, so he affirms the ONA's mandate. So he's been the chief since 1985 of the Osoyoos Indian Band. And when his mandate is to advocate, practice, preserve, and protect the culture. So they have their words, those are their TEK words, their language, a collection of teachings, their language, spiritual connections with the land, the all living things, human and non-human, and title and rights of the Syilx people. So in 2019, Chief Louis was recognized as one of the country's most distinguished business leaders and was actually inducted into the Canadian Business Hall of Fame. What he does is, and he says that Indigenous economic development and self-sufficiency are the prime ways to secure the right of his people to be who they are, to take pride in their heritage, and to protect the fragile desert landscape in which a good part of their cultural identity is forever rooted. He also says that Native people should never be in business at the expense of their language and culture. And success must not mean that you forego your heritage. Don't ever depend on government grants to provide the necessary language and culture programs. If anything is your responsibility, then this is it. And then finally, the Osoyoos Indian Band is a unique example in how Chief Louis built up his community and his people. So some of the things that he's done is he put out an advertisement in the paper back in and he said, he recognized that the education and training of his people couldn't get him where he wanted to go. So he put an ad in the Osoyoos paper and he had a big response. And so the businesses, this was at the core of all of the businesses were their teachings, and the process itself in attracting people to join him in developing these businesses was Western and mainstream, yet his vision was continued to be rooted in Osoyoos TK. So they have now OIB Holdings. They own over 32,000 acres of urban industrial commercial land located in the south. They manage 13 different lines of businesses, OIB development, and the primary sectors for these is commercial leasing, tourism, and construction. They also got NICMIP management services, which is they operate 2 provincial parks, which are highly important cultural places on OIB's traditional territory. So they have a cellar. So they have a vineyard. And I think every year they've been voted at least in the top 10 wines in the world. They have their cultural center, which attracts tourism and everybody that comes in every year. They've got their own campground. They have here's one of their provincial parks, so they obtain fees from that. And so really, what is the outcome of this is that Chief Louis is a prime example in how to build a self-sufficient community and leave a legacy in which all members can benefit. Even though they're still faced with a colonial past, their socioeconomic success currently outweighs the social dysfunctions in their community. I think they have a 2% welfare rate in their community. Everybody must work. So unless you're handicapped, disabled, or an elderly person, you are contributing to your community. And then Chief Louis, he moved OIB clearly from poverty to economic prosperity. And so what are the key takeaways? Indigenous sovereignty is essential for the Indigenous economies and sustainable economic development. I believe that geographic location plays an important role. However, I think that there's still community economic development opportunities, even if you're in a less desirable geographic location, like if you're in a flying community, because we have the ability for infrastructure, in some of them. Education, I think you need both mainstream and land-based. I think you need a combination of both, and we need to be moving our community members into healthy places of management and leadership roles. And then mainstream processes need to be guided solely on TK or the TEK foundation. And when they are, we can see great success, as evidenced by the Osoyoos Indian ban, also as evidenced by the Nisga'a government and what they do for their people, also by Member 2, which is a Mi'kmaq community that's out in Sydney. So those are just some examples of when we give the tools for Indigenous people to move forward and be competitive in the mainstream economy, that they're able to do that very successfully. So that was my outcome. I also had one on the numbered treaties, but I wanted to focus more on where we could go and how we could get there. So yeah, so any questions?
Thanks for a great presentation. So much material and so well said. Who wants to start with the questions? I see Uriel. Go ahead.
So, well, it's really inspiring, and I think that it prompts the debate because first, and Shirley, you know, I have a pending paper to be submitted that goes a little into those aspects. So the thing is, first we have to recognize that Indigenous economic development is different. But as you show, because you show two opposite examples, like the Inuit example where capitalistic activity was very damaging for the community, and then Okanagan where capitalistic activity was very successful for the community without damaging the local culture and the environment. So,
and the big difference between those two is the one who was successful, they have a sovereign nation, and they're like, no, you don't tell us what to do. If you want to negotiate with us, you do this under this. Where the other one kind of left their fate for somebody else to negotiate their fate. So, you know, my argument is when we are responsible and can develop our own fate, and we have the expertise and the people on our team to do that, we can be very successful.
And I would say that there is something that you put out there, is that communities were set up from the government and colonial perspective, they were set up to fail. So as they can step in and say, you see, you cannot handle this, I will take care of you.
Yeah.
It's a patronizing structure. But the big difference, the huge difference, I think it's, correct me if I am wrong, it's in two aspects. One is capacity. There was more previous capacity in BC than the Inuit because they were isolated for a longer time. And of course, nature didn't allow them to get in contact with those activities. And the second one is leadership. Because even if you have all the capacities, and what makes a big difference is both the combination of the capacity and the leadership that moves that forward. So do you agree that any potential strategy of economic development first shouldn't be written from the government, second will not be successful without developing first in their own terms capacity and leadership?
Yeah, they definitely need to have their community assets and resources and being trained and being allowed to come to the table. So I think that when you feel acknowledged and that you have a voice in something, and then you become to have a vested interest in it. You know, like I would even compare it as to, like right now, just because I was born in Michigan, we have, you know, the election coming up. And when Black people, African Americans, didn't have a vote, they didn't vote. When they felt that their voice wasn't going to make a difference, they didn't vote in 2016. And now they're like just heading to the polls because they feel empowered, because now they think that they feel that their voice is going to make a difference in the election. So when you have a voice, you feel inspired and motivated to move. And so I think that's where leadership then comes in. You know, like you have to have strong leaders encouraging your voice, and you have to be willing to invest in your community. And yeah, maybe it's going to take a little bit longer because English isn't their primary language, and they're going to have to isn't their first language, and they're going to have to learn that. But I think if you put those resources in, that you can have a Soyuz Indian ban outcomes throughout Canada, despite geographic location. That makes sense?
Uche, do you want to go ahead next?
Yeah, please, it's just for curiosity and knowledge acquisition to know. We have vast extensive research and ongoing as well. Permit me just to ask this question. Is also stemming from one of the statements that Uriel made, and also part of your presentation, like if you're gonna negotiate, you have to have the right skill and everything, knowledge, etc. So, in background to when the colonial people came to Africa, for instance, in Sierra Leone, so they were busy acquiring the diamond because it's everywhere. And they will tell them to go to school, and the teaching is that learning is better than silver and gold. So they get them to go to school, but then they were taking their resources, taking the diamond. And with the residential school, just wanted to see if you can help me out, because apart from what I tried to know, what was fundamentally wrong with that? What was a fundamental problem foundationally with residential school? Because knowledge, learning, or education we see is very, very vital, important. We are all still learning, and even as old as we are, we're still coming to school with children and all that. So what is the fundamental problem with the residential school? Was it just intended like the one in Sierra Leone, where they push them to go to school while they are by the background taking their resources and then giving them the kind of education that is not meant to for them to succeed? The example that you also gave with workers. So in the Niger Delta area, like I said, they are just janitors, they are cleaners, they are gatemen. So they are not given the kind of education that will help them to be engineers, accountants, and those technical aspect that requires the exploitation of the resources. So you still have colonial capitalist companies and people coming to extract the resources, because the indigenous people do not have the capacity and to negotiate and to explore their resources for their own benefit.
Okay, thank you for that. So I would first say that residential schools came out of numbered treaties, okay? And if we look at numbered treaties, it was used primarily for assimilation and the destruction of Indigenous communities. And if you look at any numbered treaty from 1 to 11, any of those treaties that were signed by chiefs, even if they could speak and write English, they were not allowed to sign in English. They had to put an X. So all of us on here, our signature would look exactly the same if we were all from Treaty 5 and we were the chiefs, because we just put an X. So this was very calculated, and this is what my elders, the information from my elders, is that that X was used to say, look at these poor Indians. They can't even write. And so from that, we need to get them into school. And there's many of the leadership at that time, the goal of residential school was to kill the Indian in the child. It wasn't to educate the Indian so they could be successful in a colonized or in a European settler world. It was to kill the Indian in the child, to assimilate. So what happened is when and it was forced, right? Like the parents didn't have a choice. And so you weren't allowed to speak your language. Like my grandfather was beaten for speaking Anishinaabe. He was tied to a register for 3 days until he decided to speak English. So at the very beginning, these schools that were set up by the churches and that were very destructive. Because if you go to a place you can't speak the language. Like you're just, you know, it's like me going to Russia and trying to take a, you know, a philosophy class. It would be impossible. And so what they also did is they were work camps, because back then agriculture was big. So they would give them substandard schooling in the day. They would give them work on the land, but not the kind of work that they're used to, working like in the crops. And the other thing is a lot of Indigenous children died. Like my grandfather was a grave digger. And so he went with 7 of his siblings and he dug graves for 2 of them. And he was like 6 years old. So that's the residential schools in the beginning. When they became day schools, they got a little better because they recognized that. But unlike where you're from, the schools here were not with the intention to give them a leg up, so they would be able to work in a European settler kind of movement, I guess. It was to kill the Indian and the child, and to be able to get more lands. Because if you can imagine a community where you have children, mothers, fathers, grandparents, and the children and the elders are the center of that. The men are the hunters, the warriors, and the women take care of everything in there. You remove the children, the elders immediately lose their role. So how do they guide then the women? The men then, when you take away their territory, their ability to migrate for food, and you put them here, so now their warrior ability, their ability to protect their territory, to hunt for their family, has now been taken away. So they demeaned and removed every single role of an Indigenous society. And so hence they just kind of became like, what do we do? You know? So that's kind of it. So that's where the education wasn't there. And then when I say they came out and they didn't belong to either world, so they weren't provided with enough tools to go here, but yet they lost any traditional way to navigate success and their language. So they couldn't no longer communicate maybe with their grandparents or their parents. Yeah. And then they were all alcoholics by that time. So it was like, imagine going away for 12 years and coming back to your community and you're like, what happened? Like, what happened? Yeah. So that's kind of, that would be that.
And so many people were abused. And if they weren't personally abused, they saw it in others.
Yeah.
It was just a sexually and physically abusive situation.
Yeah.
Can you imagine your own child at 5 or 6 being taken away from you and not being able to see them? Like it would kill me. I would be dead tomorrow if that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, Kesab.
Thank you, Tree.
Thanks.
It's really insightful and very informative, and a positive story about OIB's case study. So last time I was checking my text in Grammarly, and in one of the sentences, which was about the quoted text from Treaty 5, and Grammarly provided a feedback that a knowledgeable audience might find this sentence hard to read.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I wanted to say. And regarding this presentation and also the very inspiring story from OIB, so what I want to ask with you, or maybe share your experience, is that because here we see Chief Louis leading the community from 1985, almost the time since I was born, and until present, and also in Dakota Plains, where Chief Smokey is leading the community for longer time. I don't know the duration. And there are other communities where chief and councils, they change maybe in every 2 or 3 years.
Every 2 years, yeah.
Every 2 years. So how do you see these distinct differences in the leadership tenure and its impact on Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination movements of Indigenous peoples in Canada?
Well, what I see is that like the numbered treaties, and when you look at Chief and Council and that, they've adopted a Western government system. That's not the way that traditionally they would have their elected leaders. You know, we would go by the clan system, or we would work on, you know, like up in NUNAVIK, for example, who had the best skills on the land, and the community would decide that. And then you could be in that position. So there's hereditary chiefs, which is very common out in BC. And that goes down from family to family, unless, of course, the community decides differently. So where there's a lot of disruption and where it's hard to get things moving is in the communities under the numbered treaties, when every 2 years you have new leadership. And there's a lot of conflict that happens in Indigenous communities because of the disruption of the culture. So you have the people that go to church, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with church, I'm just saying that this is a fact. And then you have the people that are traditionalists, and then the people that went to church that adopt a Christian way of life. Anything that is not God or Jesus is kind of seen as a sin or the devil, or, you know, not good. You're going to go to hell, where traditionally we never had a heaven and a hell. We never had a hell. I don't know. We had like the afterlife. But so then that creates even further conflict in the community. So then they're fighting. So that when the churchies get into power, they make sure the traditionalists have nothing, and all their churchies get housing and funding for school. And then when the traditionalists get into power, they like make sure the churchies get nothing. And it's this thing that's kind of like where the government just kind of throws a bone and says, hey, watch them fight. We don't even have to do anything. And it's super sad. And every 2 years that happens. So when you're trying to work with communities, and every 2 years the leadership changes, you know, and if you have a research project for 4 or 5 years, you could have 3 different leaders in that. And, you know, and some of them will like you, some of them won't like you. So you're going to find your research is stalled, it goes ahead. And it can be so frustrating that I think people, I would say urban Indigenous like me, you just get frustrated in working with them, because you're like, oh my God, can you just get it together? Like, we're trying to, you know, like, you have the power to make that happen for your community. Why aren't you doing it? And so it can be really frustrating. So I see a lot of Indigenous communities are kind of like their own worst enemy. Yeah. But so the difference is that when you allow traditional governance systems to dominate, and minimal impact has happened, I think that they are more successful. I just believe that in my heart. And I can look around at different communities that I've worked with, and I see that. And I see the most, like, I see some numbered treaties doing okay, but for the most part, they are not doing as good as other ones. And that's just my personal opinion. Maybe I should write a paper on that, but that's what I see. Thanks.
I've heard chiefs and band counselors say, you know, we're part of the Indian Act and we're basically here to administrate poverty, you know, that there's really such limitations of what they can do in the role,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, for sure.
Any other questions for Trea? You raised so many great points, great examples, case studies.
Well, and it's really hard. And I do understand that's a lot of information, because it's like you kind of got to put the context around it, but then it's hard to kind of really grasp the context. Like it's a lot more, like it'll take a couple days to digest, and you might have to look at the PPT again. But yeah, it's a lot to absorb if you're just kind of being introduced to Indigenous issues, or you're not super familiar with them or semi-familiar, because there's a lot to know. Yeah.
And Trea is running a poverty to prosperity workshop. Doesn't that sound?
No, webinar.
It's not a workshop.
Poverty
It's
to
a webinar.
prosperity.
Yes, you can come in for and you'll come out rich. No, so this is a webinar with 2 different speakers, one from a community foundation in Nova Scotia, Micmac, and another in the States, Navajo. And that's this Thursday at 1 o'clock. So,
no, Wednesday, November 4th.
Oh, Wednesday. Yes.
Yeah, November 4th.
Wednesday.
And kind of a really interesting thing about this webinar. So I have Raymond Foxworth. He's the Vice President of First Nations in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's part of the Navajo Nation. And if you've been looking at like COVID cases in the era of Trump and that, the Navajo Nation has not fared out very good. They have no running water. They're in the desert, a lot of no electricity. So they're real in like third world conditions there. And so their Indigenous philanthropy has really taken a toll for the worse, you know, not for the better. And so he's looking at ways of how this needs to be shifted. And then Christopher Gugu is a Mi'kmaq, and he runs the Uluweg Indigenous Foundation in Truro, Nova Scotia. And since COVID, they've had an increase in donations. The Atlantic coast is so philanthropic, I can't believe it. Like they have so many projects going because of this and so much money coming into them. So I really think that'll be a really cool discussion maybe between those two and how maybe Gugu can provide Foxworth maybe with some tools as to how to move it. All right. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Trea. And in the context of the Micmac fisheries, right, and the violence, like this is our Black Lives Matter. It's you know, in Canada, right? It's Micmac fisheries. It's also so many other places in Canada. So you know, I think this gives us an opportunity to look at that and discuss. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Trea was amazing. Let's give her a round of applause. Just unmute yourself and yay.
Hopefully I didn't, you know, blow your guys. Oh my God. Okay. Anyway, happy Monday. Happy Monday.
Okay.
Okay. We'll talk to you later.
Have a beautiful day.